Hello, my name is Trevor, and I will be your affirmative speaker for today's round.
Hello, my name is Jason Carino, and I'll be your net case for this round.
Oh, better luck. All right, before we begin, do you have any judging philosophy that you would like us to keep in mind as we debate, just so it's easier for you to judge and for us to actually conduct this round today? Yeah. All righty then. If my opponent is ready and my judge is ready, 6 minutes on the clock. Let's begin. About a year ago, I was having a pillow fight with my 5 younger brothers, and it was great. We were having such a fun time, and everyone was laughing that I didn't stop to think about the potential dangers of our activity. Before I knew it, I had knocked my 6-year-old brother head first into the corner of a cabinet. A few hours and a trip to the ER later, he had 11 stitches right in the middle of his forehead. Had I simply stepped back and taken the time to re-examine my actions, I could have prevented the unnecessary suffering I caused my poor 6-year-old brother. It is because I hope to avoid this incident from happening on a larger scale that I affirm the resolution today of resolved in the field of biomedical engineering, restraint ought to be prioritized over scientific advancement. Now, before we actually get into my case, I wanted to go over a few points of resolutional analysis, as well as some definitions, so that we all know exactly what we are talking about during this round. Now, my first point of resolutionary analysis is when in conflict. When in conflict. This debate only matters when scientific advancement comes in conflict with restraint. We cannot have both existing equally, and it is one at the cost of the other. This does not mean, however, that we cannot have some of both simultaneously. It means that they exist in conflict, where when one is prioritized, the other is less. Now, let us go ahead and define our terms. My first term I'm going to define is scientific advancement. Scientific or technological advancement is the generation of information or the discovery of knowledge that advances the understanding of scientific relations or technology. Biomedical engineering is the application of the principles and problem-solving techniques of engineering to biology and medicine. This is evident throughout healthcare, from diagnosis and analysis to treatment and recovery. That's from Michigan Tech. And then scientific restraint revolves around the concept of rethinking or downsizing experimental projects in consideration of safety concerns built upon risk management and or ethical and moral ideals. That's from the University of Rhode Island. Now, I would like to propose an anti-value for today's round, and that anti-value is unnecessary human suffering. Now, an anti-value is something that we are seeking to avoid, whereas in a value we're trying to uphold something. An anti-value we do not value. We are trying to avoid it. And when we are looking at this resolution, it is the affirmative case that when restraint is prioritized, that is the best way to avoid unnecessary human suffering. Now, exactly what is unnecessary human suffering? Unnecessary human suffering is unnecessary human suffering beyond the status quo that can be avoided. Think back to my example in the opening. Had I not, whacked my brother into the cabinet, he would not have experienced the suffering that he did. It could have been easily avoided. Now, my reason to prefer this anti-value is that the purpose of biomedical engineering is to improve care, and the fundamental concept of do no harm is a guiding principle that is the core to who we are as researchers, biomedical engineers, and physicians. If, in the pursuit to do good and to improve care, which are both noble causes, we cause unnecessary human suffering, we become the very thing we swore to destroy and do more harm than good. Now that we have all of that out of the way, let's get right into my contentions. Now, my first contention you can tag as restraint prevents unnecessary human suffering. Restraint prevents unnecessary human suffering. When restraint is prioritized over scientific advancement, we are taking the necessary precautions and actions to limit and avoid unnecessary human suffering. And my application for this is FDA recalls. According to drugwatch.com, 4,500 drugs and devices are pulled from U.S. shelves every year by the FDA in recalls. These drugs and devices have been evaluated by the FDA as unsafe and not proper to be sold in the public market. Now, the impact of this is unnecessary human suffering avoided. Unnecessary human suffering avoided. These 4,500 drugs and medical devices per year have been removed from where they can cause unnecessary human suffering. This is that action of taking a step back and making sure that you're not doing something that is going to cause human suffering. Now, which brings me to my second contention. My second contention you can tag as scientific advancement prioritized risks unnecessary human suffering. Scientific advancement prioritized risked unnecessary human suffering. Now, when scientific advancement is prioritized, restraint is compromised. The result is unnecessary human suffering. And my application for this contention is Unit 731. Unit 731 was an experimental wing of the Japanese Army during World War II. They performed experiments upon the occupied Chinese people and American prisoners of war involving diseases such as the bubonic plague, frostbite, and many other very harsh and painful diseases. Now, the purpose of these experiments were so that the Japanese Army could figure out a better way to treat some of the diseases and things that would inflict their soldiers during wartime. And actually, many of the things that we know about these diseases today comes from these horrific experiments. But what they would do is, in their pursuit of scientific advancement, in their pursuit of improving care for their soldiers, they threw restraint to the side to an extent and were doing horrific things to the prisoners of war and the Chinese people that they were experimenting on. And the impact of this application is, unnecessary human suffering. Unnecessary human suffering. Had restraint been properly prioritized, this human suffering could have been avoided. And the impacts of the entire case, of all of my contentions and of my applications are fairly clear. Restraint ought to be prioritized over scientific advancement, lest we violate our very purpose. I now stand ready for cross-examination.
Oh gosh. Wait, I have 3 minutes, right? Cross 7 minutes?
Yes.
Sure, we don't have time to do my phone. Okay, 3 minutes on the timer. Alright. So when you said that, what's it called? Restraint ought to be prioritized over scientific advancement. Are you saying that that you should throw out scientific advancement and just restrain everything that you're doing so that it protects or it lessens the suffering of others?
To an extent, yes. What I'm really saying is that we should be taking the necessary precautions to make sure that in our pursuit of good things, like improving care, like scientific advancement, we're not doing the very thing we swore to destroy, right? With the FDA, right? The FDA is a set of regulations on our current scientific community in the United States where we are advancing, but we have those regulations and those restraints in place to make sure that we're not doing more harm than good while we're trying to scientifically advance.
Okay, may I ask another question?
Please, go ahead.
So would you say then that it's also the other way around, that to protect people from suffering, you also need advancement in different circumstances, of course, but in other times, you must also prioritize advancement over restraint to protect those from suffering?
Suffering, yes, there's suffering all over the world, and it is a fact of life, and that is what scientific advancement seeks to negate. But we're not talking about just suffering. We're talking about specifically suffering that can be avoided, suffering that is caused by reckless or dangerous actions. Like in my opener, right? Had I not whacked my brother with the pillow, he would not have gotten hurt. That is suffering that would not have happened had I not taken certain actions. And prioritizing restraint seeks to avoid taking those actions that causes that suffering.
Okay, thank you. I have no other questions. After time.
So you can stop that, and then if you want to do prep time, you can start your prep time,
Okay.
or you can just get right into your case. You have 3 minutes of prep time to use whenever you want.
Alright. I'm just gonna write it because I can't do any better than what you did. Alright. Yeah, if my judge is ready and my opponent. Yep, 7 minutes on the clock. Then let's begin. So with all the definitions my opponent said in his last case, I do agree with them, but in this resolution in the field of biomedical engineering, restraint ought to be prioritized over scientific advancement. I disagree with this. I think that scientific advancement should be prioritized over restraint. My value is protecting life. Why does this matter? It's because scientific advancement improves the protection of life. Going to my first contention, scientific restraint doesn't improve the protection of life. To tag that, you could say scientific restraint doesn't protect life. An application for this is smallpox. In 1796, English doctor Edward Jenner performed an experiment that would eventually cause the virus downfall. Jenner was able to conclude that a person could be protected from smallpox without having to be directly exposed to it. This was the world's first successful vaccine, a term that Jenner himself coined. He tried to get results published by prestigious Royal Society, only to be told not to promulgate such a wild idea if he valued his reputation. Smallpox killed some 300 million people worldwide. It dramatically altered the course of human history, even contributing to the decline of civilizations. It was to be well over 100 years before Jenner's vision finally began to be realized. After the final outbreak in the United States in 1949, the virus was declared eradicated. In 1980, the virus was eradicated in 1980, following a successful vaccination program. Because the English government was restraining Jenner from publishing his discovery, many people had died. Moving on to my second contention, scientific advancement improves protection. You can tag that as scientific advancement improves protection of life. My application for this is biomedical engineering and tissue transplantations. One of the significant achievements in biomedical engineering is composite tissue transplantations. There has been a lot of interest in the development of bioengineered structures with multiple tissue types because of the recent successes of clinical vascular composite allografts, or VCAs for short, including the face, upper and lower, and abdominal walls. This tissue transplantation serves as a replacement of traumatic losses from explosives, burns, cosmetic concerns, and various major functional injuries. As you can see here, with such a scientific advance, we can now help those who need to be helped. My second application is just going back to the definition of to finish off this application, I'm just going to tell you the definition of composite tissue transplanting, which is a type of transplantation being proposed for facial transplants in patients with severely disfigured faces, and for hands transplants in patients with dissatisfied with prosthetic hands. The treatment has potential benefits in terms of improving functional status and physiosocial well-being. Thank you. I'm now ready for cross-examination.
Alrighty. 3 minutes of cross-examination on the clock. If my opponent is ready, and my judge is ready, all right, then let's begin. Very nice speech. I just have a few questions for you. So you talked about your value, which was the protection of life, correct?
Yes.
And could you just restate your reason to prefer for that value?
So it's because scientific advancement improves the protection of life. The more we advance in science, the more we can learn about diseases and protect those from being attacked by those diseases.
Okay. And so that is disagreeing to my value. Would you say that it is important to avoid causing unnecessary human suffering to people?
Yes. You don't want to cause more suffering than there needs to be.
Okay. So does there need to be suffering? Does there need to be suffering that we need to do?
No, but I say without suffering, you're not really human. Because I say that humans, there's going to be suffering. There's never not going to be any suffering at all. There's going to be a suffering at some point, but it's just how much we can reduce that suffering.
Okay. But so then when we're seeking to, say, improve life or to scientifically advance, we should be doing everything that we can to make sure that in that pursuit we are not causing unnecessary suffering. You would agree?
Can you repeat that question, please?
Essentially, while we're trying to improve science and improve the protection of life, we shouldn't be causing harm while we're doing that, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So down to your first contention, your application for that was smallpox, correct?
Yes.
And your issue was that, I want to make sure I'm understanding, your issue was that the British journal was not publishing the work of the person who developed the smallpox vaccine, correct?
Correct, because he did not, his findings were not pushed and were not recognized by the society in England, that the cure did not get out until 100 years later.
Okay, thank you very much. And so let's jump down a bit. You talked about scientific advancement improves the protection of your life. Could you just repeat the second tag, the tag of your second contention?
Oh, shoot, sorry, it's on here. So the tag was that scientific advancement improves the protection of life.
And what was the application underneath that?
It was this biomedical engineering tissue transplantations.
All right, so the transplanting composite tissue.
Transplantations.
What is the purpose of that treatment?
It's showing you that without scientific advancement, we wouldn't have advanced so far to to develop this technology to now help people with these issues.
Right. So what does the treatment do though? The composite transplants itself. What do they actually do?
They basically change the. Oh, do we still go?
You can continue answering the question, or you can stop.
I guess I'll just stop then because it's going to be too long to explain.
All right. All right. I will begin my 3 minutes of prep time starting now. All right. 1 minute and 41 seconds left of prep time. All righty. This will be a 4-minute speech. My judge is ready. My opponent is ready.
Mm-hmm.
Let's begin. A wise man once said, begin every single speech with a quote. Now that I have that quote out of the way, I'm going to get right into my speech. Now, my opponent started off by agreeing to all of my definitions, which I really appreciated. It's not fun to have a definitions debate, but he disagreed with my value, and he offered a counter value of protecting life, and his reason to prefer was that the purpose of biomedical engineering and the result of scientific advancement was the protection of life. Now, you can tag my response as agreed to in cross X. Agreed to in cross X. During the cross-examination questions, I asked my opponent that we should, in the pursuit of pretty much any other value within the field of biomedical engineering, we should be making sure that we are not inflicting any unnecessary suffering on individuals in our experiments. In fact, that should be one of our biggest values, which was the value that I proposed in my speech. And the reason that I think that we should go with my anti-value of unnecessary human suffering is because that must take precedence over all other values. Why? Because again, we don't want to become the very thing we've sworn to destroy. If we're seeking to do good things, just like the Japanese people in the Unit 731, they were seeking to improve care and to protect the lives of their soldiers, but they were not seeking to avoid unnecessary human suffering, and in fact inflicted unnecessary human suffering upon those American prisoners of war and the Chinese people in very, very gruesome ways. And so that is really why I think that we should prefer my value over my opponent's value this round. Now, just to respond to some of his contentions, his first contention was scientific restraint doesn't protect life, and he had the application of the smallpox vaccine, and he talked about how the British the British Society did not agree to publish the findings of this man who created the first vaccine. And my response to this is they made a bad decision, but their heart was really in the right place. And that may sound like a weak argument, but essentially they were trying to avoid causing unnecessary human suffering. And there is a very strong moral argument that you can make that it is worse to cause unnecessary human suffering to, right, it's the trolley problem, right? Purposefully hurt someone, intentionally or unintentionally, based of your actions, rather than allowing things to be. Now, of course, we know that they made the wrong decision, but ultimately, going off of the information that they had back in the 18th century, based off of the studies that had been done on that practice, which were very little, this was a doctor from the colonies saying that he had the magic cure to one of the most horrific illnesses in history, and it was very counterintuitive, and so you can understand why they would make the decision that they did. Now, his second contention was scientific advancement improves the protection of life, and his application for this was biomedical engineering composite tissue transplants. And I talked about this in cross-examination, but essentially there is no impact for his application. This application, right, the result of this treatment is cosmetic things, right? It is helping people who have been damaged by explosions and been damaged by certain birth deformities or for cosmetic reasons. And this does not uphold the value that my opponent opposed of protecting life. These people are already alive, and while it is certainly making their lives better, it does not uphold the values that are even in contention in today's round. And now, for a final note, I would like to point out that my opponent responded to none of my contentions, and given that the next speech is a rebuttal speech, he cannot respond to them in the next speech. Thank you very much.
And then I 3 minutes of prep time, right?
You have 3, yeah.
Okay. 3 minutes. Ready? Final speech. It is 6 minutes, correct?
Yep.
All right. If the judge is ready, and opponent. All right, let's begin. I want to talk first about how my opponent attacked my first contention when he said that it was a mistake for the for this English society that they didn't push Jenner's vaccine forward. It was just a mistake, which happens in all humans. Which is, I agree with him on that. But even though they had good intentions, not all people are evil. I always want to say that like most people I wouldn't agree that most people are trying to do something wrong. But like they didn't even test the vaccine Jenner put out. They didn't even look at it. They just told him because they didn't think that it was possible that that if he wanted to keep his place in society, he shouldn't even like put it like even publish it. They didn't even look at it. That's what I'm talking about here. With scientific advance, if you prioritize scientific advancement, yes, there is a little bit of risk, but you need to take risk to get reward. With restraint, it drastically slows finding cures and solutions to other problems in biomedical engineering. But with scientific advancement, yes, there is a little bit of risk, but that's what science is. In science, there's always risk in what you're doing. There's always a risk of something might going wrong, which is what restraint is for, that if something does go wrong, that it's drastically reduced. But even when something goes wrong, you still make that advancement in science and knowledge that you know that maybe that specific solution doesn't work with another, and you find a cure or the solution of the problem that you have. That's why I think you need to prioritize scientific advancement over restraint. My opponent also attacked my second contention and application, which was the biomedical engineering and composite tissue transplantations. He said that there was like, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you basically meant was that there's no actual like battle between the restraint and scientific advancement, and there's no actual like meaning of this, correct? Well, I'm here to say that like without scientific advancement, we wouldn't have made all these advancements. There was risks and maybe some problems with finding this, but without taking those risks and those jumps, the advancements they took, they wouldn't have found the answers to the problems in scientific tissue transplantations. And how does this protect life, my opponent asked? Well, it protects those. Protection isn't just one thing. It can be multiple things. A protection of yourself, like anxiety, protection from other beings, like fighting in wars. And in this specific one, it's more of the anxiety aspect, where you help those with disfigured faces or hands so that they can go out and be the person they wanted to be. With like a disfigured face or hands, maybe they couldn't play baseball, maybe they could have been in acting like they wanted to, but now they can. They can play baseball, football, they can go be acting. If you didn't hear me, but I also said that it also helps with losses from like explosions and burns. Those can also help protect your skin from taking worse damage than it already has. And that's why I think that scientific advancement should be prioritized over scientific restraint. Please vote for the negative side. Thank you.
All right, I will begin my 1 minute, 41 seconds of my time. All right. Going to conclude it there, and go to my final speech. This will be a 3-minute speech. If my judge is ready, my opponent is ready, let's begin. Either you die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. That is a quote from the Batman trilogy by Harvey Dent, who is Two-Face, and it is well known among comic fans and fans of the movies. But what I'm going to do in this speech is I want you to keep that quote in the back of your mind as I respond to my opponent's case and revamp my case in 4 key voting issues. And these voting issues, I think, are the main reasons why you should, in the end, vote for the affirmative side and affirm today's resolution. Now, my first voting issue you can tag as affirmative burden upheld. Affirmative burden upheld. My job as the affirmative team is to prove that 51% of the time, yes, restraint ought to be prioritized over scientific advancement. And I have done that throughout my cases, as I have demonstrated that we are valuing, as in not valuing, unnecessary human suffering. And what I have shown through the impacts of my contentions and the impacts of my applications is that prioritizing restraint is the best way to avoid causing unnecessary human suffering. Now, my second voting issue you can tag as negative burden failed. Negative burden failed. My opponent has failed to cast doubt or disprove the resolution today against my contentions. He didn't respond to a single one of my points. He didn't respond to the impacts, which means that they stand in this round. And his impacts, when weighed against mine, are rather minor considering the impacts that I brought before you. My third voting issue you can tag as value 1. Value 1. Again, my opponent did not respond to my response to his value, which means that the value again stands in this debate round. And if you look at my contentions and his contentions do not uphold the value of avoiding unnecessary human suffering, which is the value that won in this debate round. And what I demonstrated through my contentions is that, yes, prioritizing restraint is the best way to avoid unnecessary human suffering. Now, my fourth voting issue is no negative impact. No negative impact. Again, when you look at the negative case, his impacts, he does make some curious arguments in his second contention about protecting from anxiety and protecting and being able to go out and live the life that you may want to live. But that isn't the argument that his contention made, nor does it uphold the values that were in contest during today's round. That is a fine argument, but again, we're talking about avoiding unnecessary human suffering, and ultimately restraint is the best way to do that. And my fifth and final voting issue is dropped points. I've said it enough today. I personally am not a fan of using that as an argument, but my opponent did not respond to a single one of my contentions, meaning that the impacts of those contentions still stand today. And for all of these reasons, Judge, I urge you to vote affirmative. Thank you very much.
Good job, guys.